My name is Lily. I'm 29 years old. And until recently, I thought I understood who I was. I was confident, independent, the kind of woman people described as self-aware. I believed I knew my limits. My values. My red flags. That belief is the reason this story still unsettles me. I've always been good at appearing put together. Not in a perfect way, just controlled. I paid my bills on time, maintained friendships, kept my emotions within acceptable boundaries. I didn't fall apart publicly. I didn't make impulsive decisions. I didn't lose myself in other people. At least, that's what I thought. I grew up learning how to be adaptable. My parents loved me, but they were busy surviving their own lives. I learned early not to demand too much attention, to read the room, to adjust, to be easy. That skill followed me into adulthood. I became the woman who didn't complicate things. The woman people felt comfortable around. The woman who rarely asked herself what she actually wanted because wanting felt risky. By my late 20s, my life looked stable. I had a decent job, a small but loyal group of friends, a relationship that everyone approved of. His name was Andrew. We met in our early 20s and grew up together in a way that felt safe. He was steady, predictable, emotionally available in a calm, measured way. Being with him felt like choosing the right answer. We talked about the future in abstract terms. Marriage, someday. Kids, probably. A house, eventually. Nothing felt urgent, and that was comforting. I told myself that urgency was overrated, that mature love was supposed to feel settled, not consuming. Still, there were moments, quiet ones, when something inside me hesitated. Not dissatisfaction, more like distance, as if part of me was observing my own life from a few steps away. I ignored that feeling. I had gotten very good at that. The year I turned 29 was the year everything felt slightly louder. Not outwardly. Internally. I began to notice patterns I had previously dismissed. How often I compromised before even voicing an opinion. How quickly I adapted to other people's expectations. How rarely I asked myself whether I was choosing or simply continuing. These realizations didn't come with answers, only discomfort. The shift began with something small. A new project at work, a new environment, a reminder that I existed outside the roles I had grown comfortable in. That's where I met him. Not someone dramatic, not someone obviously dangerous. Just someone who asked questions I wasn't used to answering. At first, I didn't see it as significant. I was friendly, open, professional. But there was something unsettling about how easily I found myself talking. Not about work, about ideas, about doubts, about parts of myself I hadn't given language to yet. It felt unfamiliar and strangely relieving. I didn't tell Andrew about these conversations, not because I was hiding anything, because I didn't yet understand what there was to explain. Nothing had happened. No lines crossed and no intentions formed. Just a quiet shift in awareness. At night, lying next to someone who loved me, I began to feel an unfamiliar tension. Not guilt, curiosity, a question I had never allowed myself to ask fully. What if the life I'm living isn't wrong but incomplete? That thought scared me more than dissatisfaction ever could, because it meant the problem wasn't circumstance. It was me. I told myself it was a phase. That self-reflection always feels destabilizing before it settles. That everyone questions their life occasionally, especially nearing 30. I didn't know then that questioning can become a door. And once it opens, you don't always get to decide what walks through. Looking back now, I can see that this was the beginning. Not of betrayal, not of a mistake, but of awareness. And awareness, once it arrives, refuses to be ignored. At the time, though, I still believed I was in control. That I could examine these thoughts without letting them change anything. That I could stay exactly where I was and simply understand myself better. I didn't realize that understanding yourself often demands movement, and that staying still can become its own kind of choice. Once you notice a crack, you start seeing where it spreads. That was the unsettling part. Nothing in my life had changed, and yet, everything felt slightly misaligned. I still woke up next to Andrew, still went to work, still laughed with friends. But something in me had shifted from passive living to quiet observation. I was watching myself. At work, the conversations continued. Not constantly, not dramatically, just often enough to matter. He asked questions that didn't demand answers. They invited them. What motivated me, what drained me, what I would do if expectations weren't a factor. I found myself responding honestly before I had time to filter. That scared me, because honesty felt exposed. I told myself it was harmless, that self-awareness was healthy, that conversation wasn't intention, that curiosity wasn't betrayal. And technically, all of that was true. But it ignored something important. I wasn't curious about ideas. I was curious about myself, and that curiosity had been awakened by another person. At home, Andrew remained unchanged. That was part of the problem. He was kind, consistent, emotionally available in a steady, predictable way. He didn't provoke uncertainty. He didn't challenge me. He accepted me, or at least the version of me I had been presenting for years. And suddenly, that acceptance felt complicated. I began noticing how often I adjusted around him without realizing it. How quickly I agreed, how easily I deferred. Not because he demanded it, because I offered it. I had mistaken accommodation for maturity. There were moments when he talked about the future, and I felt myself pull back internally. Not panic, distance. As if the timeline he described belonged to a version of me that no longer felt fully present. That realization filled me with guilt, because he hadn't done anything wrong. I tried to reconnect. I suggested date nights, initiated intimacy, asked more questions. I told myself effort would realign things. But effort without clarity only amplified the disconnect. I was trying to feel something I didn't yet understand. Meanwhile, my inner world grew louder. I began journaling, not with intention, but with urgency. Questions poured out. What do I actually want? When did being easy become my default? Do I choose my life, or simply maintain it? I didn't like how few answers I had. One evening, Andrew asked me if something was wrong. Not suspiciously. Concerned. The question sat between us. I considered telling him everything. Then I imagined the confusion in his eyes, the uncertainty I didn't even know how to explain. So I said, I'm just tired. It wasn't a lie. It just wasn't complete. The guilt crept in after that. Not because of anything I had done. Because of what I wasn't saying. I began to understand that silence isn't neutral. It's a choice that protects the present at the expense of the future. The boundaries at work blurred in subtle ways. Longer conversations, shared jokes, moments of quiet understanding that felt too personal to be accidental. Nothing crossed a line, but the line became harder to define, and that ambiguity was dangerous. One afternoon, he asked me if I was happy. The question caught me off guard. I laughed, reflexively, and gave a vague answer. He didn't push, but I could tell he noticed. So did I. That night, I lay awake replaying the question. Not because of who asked it, because I didn't know how to answer. I realized how rarely I had asked myself that question honestly, how often I substituted stability for fulfillment, how quickly I dismissed discomfort as immaturity. I wasn't unhappy, but I wasn't awake either, and that distinction mattered more than I wanted to admit. The tension became internal. I didn't fantasize about leaving, that I didn't imagine another life in detail. I simply felt caught between who I had been and who I was becoming, and that space felt unbearable. I started pulling back from my friends. Not intentionally. I just didn't know how to articulate what I was experiencing. There was no clear conflict at no event to point to, just a growing sense that something fundamental was misaligned. The truth I avoided was simple and terrifying. If I continued exactly as I was, I would remain safe and quietly unfulfilled. If I spoke honestly, I risked destabilizing everything. Either way, something would be lost. I told myself I had time, that clarity would come naturally, that I didn't need to rush. But deep down, I knew time wasn't neutral either. It was shaping the outcome whether I acknowledged it or not. By the end of that month, I could no longer pretend this was just a phase. I had crossed an internal threshold, not into action, into awareness. And awareness, once fully formed, demands a response. I still believed I could handle this quietly, that I could sort it out internally before anything external changed. I didn't yet understand that the longer you delay truth, the heavier it becomes when it finally asks to be spoken. There's a moment when awareness turns into pressure. Not loud, not dramatic, just constant. That's where I was. I stopped pretending I didn't know what was happening. Not externally, I still played my role well. Internally, though, the narrative had changed. I wasn't figuring things out anymore. I was delaying a truth I was afraid to face. The strangest part was how ordinary everything looked. Andrew still kissed my forehead before leaving for work, still asked about my day, still trusted me completely. That trust weighed on me more than suspicion ever could, because I was no longer sure I deserved it. At work, the atmosphere shifted, not because anything new happened, because what already existed became undeniable. Silences grew heavier, eye contact lasted longer, there was an understanding that didn't need words. And that scared me, because understanding creates responsibility. One afternoon, we were alone in the conference room. Not intentionally, just circumstance. The kind that feels innocent until you realize how carefully you've stopped avoiding it. He asked how I was doing. Not the polite version. The real one. I didn't answer right away. That pause said more than anything I could have spoken. I feel stuck, I finally said. It was the first honest sentence I had spoken out loud in weeks. He didn't interrupt, didn't advise, didn't analyze. He just listened. That made it harder. I didn't tell him everything, but I told him enough. About feeling disconnected from my own life, about how everything looked right but felt wrong, about how exhaustion wasn't physical anymore. He nodded slowly, not in recognition of himself, in recognition of me. That was the moment something crossed an invisible boundary. Not because of desire, because of intimacy. Emotional intimacy creates a bond that doesn't announce itself as dangerous until it is. I went home that night feeling hollow. Not guilty. Conflicted. Guilt implies wrongdoing. I was still clinging to the belief that nothing had technically happened. But something had shifted permanently. Andrew noticed. Not immediately, but gradually. I was quieter, less present, more distracted. He asked again if something was wrong. This time, I couldn't hide behind tiredness. I said, I don't know what I'm feeling. It was true, and deeply unfair. He reached for my hand. That simple gesture nearly broke me, because comfort felt undeserved, because I couldn't offer clarity in return. That night, I cried silently beside him, not because I wanted someone else, but because I no longer knew how to be fully here. I realized then that emotional absence hurts more than physical distance. The following weeks were heavy. I started avoiding being alone with anyone. At work. At home, even with myself. Avoidance became my coping mechanism. But avoidance doesn't erase tension. It stores it. I found myself replaying moments from the past. Not memories of love, moments of choice. Times when I had said yes because it was expected, when I had stayed because leaving felt selfish, when I had silenced myself to maintain peace. A pattern emerged, and I didn't like it. I had built a life around being agreeable, reliable. Low maintenance, emotionally efficient. And now that structure was suffocating me. One evening, Andrew talked about moving in together. Casually, assumptively. He described furniture arrangements, weekend routines, future trips. I listened, and felt a quiet panic bloom in my chest. Not fear of him. Fear of myself disappearing completely. I excused myself to the bathroom and locked the door. I stared at my reflection. I didn't recognize the woman looking back. She looked composed, responsible, and profoundly disconnected. That was the first time the thought surfaced clearly. What if staying is the wrong choice? The thought terrified me, because leaving would hurt someone I cared about, but staying might destroy something in me. I wanted certainty, a sign. A moment, anything that would justify action. But life doesn't always provide permission. Sometimes it only offers discomfort. I began to realize that I wasn't standing at a crossroads between two people. I was standing between truth and familiarity, between growth and preservation, between honesty and comfort. I still hadn't crossed a line, but I was standing so close to it that my balance was compromised. And balance, once lost, rarely returns on its own. The tension reached a breaking point one night when Andrew asked a simple question. "Do you still see a future with me?" The room felt too quiet, too small, too honest. I opened my mouth to reassure him, and nothing came out. That silence shattered something. Not dramatically, irreversibly. I knew then that avoidance was no longer an option. That clarity wouldn't arrive gently. That whatever came next would require courage I wasn't sure I possessed. I went to bed that night knowing one thing for certain. The life I was living could not continue unchanged. And the cost of delaying truth was becoming heavier than the fear of facing it. After the silence, nothing felt neutral anymore. Every word carried weight. Every pause felt intentional. I could no longer hide behind confusion because confusion had solidified into knowing. The morning after that question, I woke up before Andrew. I watched him sleep, trying to locate certainty in his familiar face. Instead, I felt distance. Not emotional distance. Existential. Like I was already halfway gone, even though my body was still there. I didn't go to work that day. I told my manager I wasn't feeling well. That wasn't a lie. The discomfort had simply shifted locations. I spent the morning walking. No destination. No music. Just movement. I needed to feel like my body belonged to me again. As I walked, I replayed the last few years of my life, not emotionally but structurally. How I made decisions. How I stayed. How rarely I challenged what was comfortable. A pattern too consistent to ignore. The truth I had been avoiding became impossible to dismiss. I wasn't unhappy because of one person or one situation. I was unhappy because I had stopped choosing consciously. I had been living by momentum. When I returned home, Andrew was there. He had taken the afternoon off. He said he wanted to talk. The way he said it told me this conversation would change things. We sat on opposite ends of the couch. That detail mattered. Proximity used to be instinctive. Now it felt loaded. He spoke first. He said he felt me pulling away, that he didn't understand why, that he was scared, not of losing me, of not knowing who I was anymore. I listened, truly listened, because he deserved that, because he wasn't wrong. When it was my turn, I struggled to begin. Not because I lacked words, because the words had consequences. I told him I had changed, not suddenly, gradually, and that I hadn't known how to bring him with me. I told him that something in me had gone quiet, and that pretending otherwise was becoming unbearable. I didn't mention anyone else, because this wasn't about another person. It was about me. He asked if I still loved him. The question cracked my composure. Love felt too small a word for what I felt. I cared deeply. I respected him. But love, the kind that creates forward momentum, felt uncertain. I told him the truth, that I didn't know. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't avoidance. It was impact. He stood up and paced the room, then stopped, then sat back down. He asked if I wanted to leave. Not angrily, almost gently. I said I needed space. Not a breakup, not a decision. Space to understand myself without the pressure of maintaining an image. He nodded. That nod hurt more than anger would have. We agreed I would stay with a friend for a few days. Just time. Just breathing room. No conclusions. Packing a bag felt surreal. Like acting out a scene I had imagined but never believed would happen. Andrew stood in the doorway, watching, not stopping me. That restraint felt like kindness and like loss. At my friend's place, the quiet was different. There was no expectation. No role to play. I slept badly. Thought constantly. Cried unexpectedly. The days stretched. Without Andrew's presence, I noticed how much of myself had been organized around him. My routines.my emotional rhythm.my sense of direction. That realization was sobering. Not because it was wrong. Because it was unconscious. I met the man from work once during that time. Briefly. Publicly. I told him I needed distance, that I was sorting things out. He respected that immediately. That respect clarified something painful. Boundaries feel different when you're ready to set them. Alone, I asked myself questions I could no longer avoid. If no one else were involved, what would I choose? If comfort weren't a factor, what would feel honest? If fear weren't driving me, where would I go? The answers frightened me, but they were clear. I wasn't running toward something. I was stepping away from who I had been, and that required grief. When Andrew and I spoke again, it was calmer, less emotional, more real. We acknowledged that something fundamental had shifted, that neither of us was wrong, that love doesn't always evolve in the same direction. He asked me if this was the beginning of the end. I told him I didn't know, but I knew I couldn't return to how things were, not without losing myself. That night, alone again, I realized something unsettling. I felt relief, not joy, not excitement, relief. The kind that comes when you stop lying, even partially. I didn't know how this would end. I only knew that the version of me who avoided truth no longer existed. And whatever came next would require courage I was still learning how to access. There is a strange calm that comes after you admit the truth to yourself. Not peace, not confidence, just clarity. And clarity is terrifying because it removes excuses. The days after I left Andrew's apartment felt unreal. Like I was living someone else's life, moving through routines without fully inhabiting them. I woke up without knowing where I belonged, and I went to sleep without certainty about what came next. But underneath the confusion, something unexpected settled in. Honesty. Andrew and I spoke every few days, carefully, like people handling something fragile. We avoided accusations, avoided blame. We talked about logistics, time, space, next steps. But beneath every conversation was the same unspoken question. Is this temporary, or the beginning of goodbye? I tried to imagine going back. Not emotionally, practically. Moving my things back, resuming routines, pretending the rupture had been a misunderstanding. The image felt heavy. Not wrong. Just wrong for me. That realization came with guilt. Because Andrew was still kind. Still patient. Still willing to wait while I figured things out. And part of me wanted to accept that gift. Not because it was right. Because it was familiar. One evening, we met to talk in person. Neutral ground. A small cafe where neither of us had memories. He looked tired. So did I. We sat across from each other like two people acknowledging a truth neither wanted to say first. He asked me directly if there was someone else. I hesitated. Not because I wanted to lie. Because the answer required nuance I didn't know how to offer. I told him there wasn't anyone I was choosing, but that there had been a connection that forced me to confront things I had been ignoring for years. He absorbed that quietly, then asked the question I had been dreading. Do you want this to work? Not can it? Not should it? Do you want it? I realized then how often I had relied on potential instead of desire. How many decisions I justified with it makes sense instead of it feels right. That distinction changed. I told him the truth. That I cared deeply. That I respected him. That I didn't regret our years together. But that I no longer felt aligned with the life we were building. Saying it out loud felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. He nodded slowly and said something that still stays with me. I don't want to be someone you stay without a fear. That sentence broke me open. Because it was generous and devastating. We didn't argue. We didn't cry loudly. We simply acknowledged that love alone isn't always enough, especially when it asks one person to disappear to survive. We decided to end things. Not dramatically, not impulsively, with sadness, with respect, with the understanding that staying would eventually turn us into strangers anyway. Walking away that night felt surreal. I expected panic. Instead, I felt hollow, like something fundamental had been removed, not replaced yet. Just gone. The weeks that followed were quiet, painfully so. I missed him, not the relationship. Him. His presence, his steadiness, the comfort of being known. I questioned myself constantly. Had I made a mistake? Was I chasing discomfort instead of appreciating stability? But every time doubt surfaced, so did a deeper truth. I was no longer suppressing myself, and that mattered more than certainty. The connection at work faded naturally. Without secrecy, without tension, it lost its intensity. That taught me something important. It was never about him. It was about what he revealed. I began rebuilding my life slowly, not dramatically. Small choices. Saying no when I meant no. Sitting with discomfort instead of smoothing it over. Listening to myself without immediately judging the answer. I learned that independence isn't loud. It's quiet. It's choosing yourself even when no one is watching. I don't see myself as brave. I see myself as someone who waited too long and finally stopped waiting. This story isn't about leaving a relationship. It's about leaving a version of yourself that no longer fits, and accepting that growth often looks like loss before it looks like freedom. My name is Lily. I'm 29 years old, and this was the moment I chose to stop living on autopilot. No one tells you how quiet life becomes after you choose yourself. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, the empty kind. After Andrew and I ended things, my days lost their familiar structure. There was no one to check in with. No shared rhythm. No automatic sense of direction. Freedom, I learned, doesn't arrive fully formed. It arrives as space, and space can be terrifying. I moved into a small apartment on the other side of the city. Nothing special. White walls, minimal furniture, boxes I unpacked slowly, as if delaying permanence would make everything less real. The first night there, I slept on the floor. Not because I had to, because the bed felt too final. Mornings were the hardest. There was no shared routine to anchor me, no quiet comfort of another presence. I woke up with a heaviness in my chest that felt like regret, until I realized it was grief, not for the relationship alone, for the version of myself that believed safety was the same as fulfillment. I questioned myself constantly. Had I been selfish? Had I confused restlessness with truth? Had I walked away from something good chasing an undefined more? Those questions didn't come with answers, only echoes. Friends tried to help. They told me I was brave, that I was young, that everything would make sense eventually. Their reassurance felt well-meaning and completely disconnected from my reality. Bravery didn't feel brave. It felt lonely. At work, I changed. Not outwardly. Internally. I stopped engaging in conversations that fed my uncertainty. The connection that once felt electric now felt distant, neutral. Without secrecy, it lost its charge. That clarity hurt, because it meant the intensity had been internal all along. Evenings stretched. I filled them with small rituals. Cooking slowly, long walks, journaling without trying to reach conclusions. I wasn't searching for answers anymore. I was learning how to sit with questions. Some nights, I missed Andrew so intensely it felt physical. Not the relationship. Him. His voice, his calm, the way he knew my habits. I wondered if choosing myself meant choosing perpetual longing. But something subtle was happening beneath the loneliness. I began noticing my own reactions. What I liked, what I avoided, what energized me. Without someone else's presence shaping my responses, my internal world became clearer. Uncomfortable, but clear. I started therapy, not to fix anything, to understand myself, to trace the pattern of adaptation that had guided my life. How often I had shaped myself to fit, instead of asking whether the space was right. One session, my therapist asked me a question that stayed with me. When was the first time you learned that being easy was safer than being honest? The answer surprised me. It wasn't recent. It was childhood. And suddenly, my adult relationships made sense. Understanding that didn't erase the pain, but it gave it context. And context softened the self-blame. I learned that independence isn't the absence of attachment. It's the ability to choose it consciously. That insight came slowly, through repetition, through silence, through sitting alone without rushing to fill the void. Weeks turned into months. The ache dulled, not disappeared, just integrated. I stopped waking up with panic, started waking up with curiosity. Small questions replaced heavy ones. What do I want today? What feels honest right now? What choice belongs to me? I wasn't happier, but I was more present, and that mattered. One evening, I caught my reflection in a store window. I looked different, not lighter, more grounded, like someone who had stopped apologizing internally. I realized then that healing isn't dramatic. It's repetitive. It's choosing yourself again and again, even when no one applauds, even when it feels inconvenient, even when it hurts. I didn't regret leaving. I regretted how long it took me to listen to myself. But regret, I learned, can coexist with gratitude. This part of my life wasn't about closure. It was about integration. Learning to carry loss without letting it define me. Learning that loneliness isn't a failure, it's a transition. I was no longer the woman who lived on autopilot, but I wasn't yet the woman I was becoming. I was in between. And for the first time, that felt honest.
I turned 30 quietly. No party, and oh dramatic milestone, just a candle on a small cake, alone in my apartment. For the first time in my adult life, that didn't scare me. There was a time when I believed being alone meant something had gone wrong. That solitude was a consequence, not a choice. Now it felt like space I had earned. Not because I had done something brave. Because I had stopped avoiding myself. My life didn't look impressive from the outside. No big promotion, and oh new relationship, and oh visible transformation. But internally something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer negotiating with my own truth. I thought often about Andrew. Not with regret. With gratitude. For what we shared, for what we couldn't become, for the way our ending taught me how to leave with honesty instead of resentment. I realized love doesn't always mean staying. Sometimes it means releasing each other before bitterness replaces care. I also thought about the person I used to be. The woman who adapted effortlessly, who prioritized harmony over clarity, who believed being easy made her lovable. I didn't judge her anymore. She did what she knew how to do. But she wasn't who I wanted to be moving forward. Life began to fill in slowly. Not with people. With intention. I chose how to spend my time, what conversations to engage in, what I no longer wanted to tolerate. I learned that boundaries aren't walls. They're definitions. I noticed how differently I showed up in small moments. I paused before agreeing, asked for clarification, allowed discomfort without rushing to soothe it. These weren't dramatic changes. They were quiet acts of self-respect. Sometimes I felt lonely, but loneliness no longer felt like a verdict. It felt like information, a signal to check in with myself, not abandon myself. I dated again eventually, carefully, without urgency, without performing a version of myself designed to be chosen. Some connections faded quickly. Others lingered. I let them. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of being too much or not enough. What surprised me most was how ordinary happiness became. Not constant joy, just alignment. Waking up without a knot in my chest, making decisions without rehearsing them for approval, feeling present in my own life. I learned that fulfillment isn't about intensity. It's about coherence. When your inner life and outer choices stop arguing with each other. This story doesn't have a moral. No villain, and oh hero. Just a woman who mistook comfort for truth and learned, slowly, how to tell the difference. If I could speak to the woman I was at 29, I wouldn't warn her. I would thank her for noticing, for questioning, for not numbing herself when it would have been easier. Some people will hear this story and think I gave up too soon. Others will think I waited too long. Both can be true. What matters is that I stopped living on autopilot. My name is Lily. I'm 30 years old now. And this wasn't the story of losing love. It was the story of learning how to stay with myself.